a major escalation in President Trump's trade war. The president now firing back at the retaliation Europe took yesterday.
Today, we have some interesting news. The European Union and Canada are making headlines after responding to the recent actions taken by Donald John Trump, President of the United States of America. The United States had placed tariffs on imported goods, and this led to serious reactions from its trade partners. In response, leaders in Europe and Canada have decided to act. They have taken steps that people see as a sign that they will not accept policies that harm their economic interests. This report covers what took place, the measures put in place by these nations, and the effects of the policies on the United States. As Trump tightened his grip with tariffs, allies struck back, swift and calculated. Let's dive into how it all began and the storm it unleashed. United States tariffs and trade tensions. In the early days of the current trade conflict, the United States began to impose tariffs on imported goods such as steel and aluminum. These measures, announced by President Donald Trump, were intended to protect domestic industries from foreign competition. The move was justified by the administration as a necessary step to safeguard American jobs and national security. However, these tariffs quickly intensified disagreements with trade partners who saw them as an unjust interference with free trade. As the tariffs came into effect, markets reacted with uncertainty, and businesses began to question the long-term impact on the economy. Trade experts pointed out that these tariffs were part of a larger trend toward protectionism in the United States of America. The decision led to different responses across political and economic circles. Some people within the state praised the move as a good defense of national interests, while many international partners decried it as an aggressive act that risked igniting a full-blown trade war. Since then, many people, including policymakers, have been talking about the merits and risks associated with such drastic measures. Inside Washington, policymakers were divided on the issue. Many argued that the tariffs would force other nations to come to the negotiating table, while critics warned that the resulting trade barriers could lead to retaliatory measures. Newspapers and TV stations reported on what was happening, with headlines warning of a brewing international crisis. The United States, long seen as a champion of free trade, was now facing criticism for decisions that appeared to undermine global economic stability. Business leaders across several industries voiced their concerns. Manufacturers who relied on imported raw materials found themselves facing increased costs. Exporters worried that foreign markets would retaliate by imposing similar tariffs on American goods. In response to these fears, some companies began to explore alternative supply chains and markets to reduce their reliance on imports. This changing situation also led to fluctuations in stock prices, with investors getting worried about what could happen. Political analysts described the situation as a turning point. The tariffs marked a departure from decades of stable trade relations, and they raised questions about the future direction of the United States' economic policy. Within the government, arguments were heated. Some lawmakers saw the tariffs as a necessary measure to rebalance trade deficits, while others said that the policy was short-sighted and risky. As the implications of these choices started to become clear, there was some sense of excitement and tension in the air in Washington. Across the Atlantic, European leaders monitored the situation with concern. Many felt that the United States move had been taken without proper consultation with allies who shared similar interests in maintaining open markets. In Canada, officials expressed disappointment over what they perceived as a unilateral action that could harm long-standing economic partnerships. The combination of strong domestic support for the tariffs and growing international opposition created the conditions for a significant global response. Economic indicators started to show signs of strain. Trade volumes dropped in key sectors, and consumer confidence began to decline. Reports from financial institutions hinted at the possibility of slower growth if the conflict escalated further. As the talks continued, there was little doubt that the tariffs had already altered the course of international trade. The policy had transformed a normal economic decision into a critical moment that could alter the balance of power between nations. Amid these developments, many citizens in the United States began to notice the impact on their daily lives. Rising prices in supermarkets and higher costs for imported goods became a part of everyday conversation. The connection between government policy and personal finances was no longer abstract, as it had become a reality that affected households across the country. Public opinion was divided, with some supporting the idea of protecting local jobs, while others worried about the broader economic consequences. As things kept changing, experts were quick to advise caution. They pointed out that it would take months, maybe even years, to fully understand the impact of the tariffs. The complexity of global trade meant that a single decision could affect many sectors. With so much uncertainty looming, everyone involved, from government officials to ordinary citizens, had to prepare for a period of adjustment. The groundwork was laid for future events that could soon change the nature of international trade. Both political determination and economic risk characterize this historical period. Once a champion for free markets, the United States has taken a step that many perceived as a stride toward economic isolation. Meanwhile, the ruling led to talks about reciprocity and fairness in international trade. As trade partners started to think about how to react to what many now thought was an aggressive policy shift, the days ahead threatened to present more difficulties. International trade was about to enter a new era that would be characterized by brave decisions and unanticipated outcomes. As tensions mounted, one thing became clear: America's allies weren't going to sit idly by. The question wasn't if they would respond, but how hard they would hit back. And with the EU and Canada at the forefront, the stage was set for a bold and strategic counterstrike. The EU and Canada take a stand. In reaction to the United States tariffs, leaders in the European Union and Canada quickly moved to formulate a response that would protect their economic interests. Both regions had long relied on strong trade relationships with the United States, and the sudden imposition of tariffs had raised serious concerns about future cooperation. Early meetings among policymakers in Brussels and Ottawa focused on gathering information and consulting with industry experts to determine the most effective course of action. European officials emphasized that their response would be measured and aimed at restoring fairness in trade. They held several high-level discussions to assess the impact of the United States measures on European businesses. These discussions revealed widespread apprehension over the potential for long-term economic damage if no countermeasures were taken. To signal their displeasure and protect their industries, the European Union decided to take retaliatory steps that would directly challenge the tariffs implemented by the United States. In Canada, the government expressed a similar level of concern. Canadian officials said that the tariffs threatened not only the economy, but also the long-standing trust between the two nations. Given the close geographic and economic ties, Canada could not stand by without taking action. The Canadian government quickly began consultations with industry leaders and economists to craft a response that would both defend its interests and send a clear message to America. Both the European Union and Canada agreed that any response must be rooted in fact and fairness. The European Commission, in particular, commissioned detailed research to assess the economic impact of the tariffs. The research provided a clear picture of the potential harm to European exports and helped policymakers decide on a range of possible measures. Among the options considered were the imposition of counter-tariffs, adjustments to trade agreements, and other legal measures within the framework of international law. During the ongoing private discussions, European and Canadian media started reporting on the increasing unity among trading partners. The coverage in these areas highlighted that the response was not solely about economic factors, but also about upholding common values and principles. Officials made sure to present their actions as essential measures to create fair competition rather than aggressive moves. Public statements from key figures in the European Union stressed the seriousness of the situation. Leaders noted that the tariffs of the United States were seen as a unilateral move that undermined the cooperative spirit that had long characterized international trade. By choosing to act together, the EU and Canada aimed to demonstrate that they were not willing to tolerate measures that could destabilize global commerce. Their approach was one of serious determination, with every decision made after thorough analysis and consultation. In Canada, the government reiterated its commitment to a rules-based international order. The Canadian Prime Minister addressed the nation, emphasizing that the tariffs were not acceptable and that a quick response was needed to protect Canadian jobs and industries. The message was clear. Canada would stand firm and work with its partners to counter the adverse effects of the policies made by the United States of America. The reaction was met with support from many business leaders who feared that a failure to respond could lead to further economic isolation. The coordinated approach between the European Union and Canada was seen as a turning point in international trade relations. By aligning their responses, these regions hoped to send a strong signal that unilateral protectionist measures would not be tolerated. The strategic discussions continued well into the night in both Brussels and Ottawa, as officials fine-tuned the details of their planned countermeasures. Every proposal was investigated for its potential economic impact, legal ramifications, and political symbolism. The resulting strategy combined legal action with economic pressure. Both the European Union and Canada prepared to impose their tariffs on specific goods coming from the United States, a step that was intended to force negotiations and eventually lead to a more balanced trading relationship. While the measures were designed to be proportionate, they also carried the weight of a strong political message. By acting decisively, the European Union and Canada aimed to safeguard their economies and uphold the principles of fair trade. In the weeks that followed the initial announcement of the United States tariffs, preparations for the counterstrike intensified. Officials from both regions worked closely with legal advisors, trade experts, and industry representatives to ensure that every aspect of their response was well planned. The emphasis was on clear communication and factual reporting. Every step was documented to maintain transparency and to provide evidence that the actions were based on sound economic reasoning rather than emotion or retaliation alone. This phase of consultation and preparation created the foundation for the next phase of the conflict. It represented an important moment when two of the world's top economic powers decided to no longer remain passive in the face of unilateral aggression. The wise and intentional planning by the European Union highlighted their commitment to safeguarding their interests while also ensuring the stability of the global trading system. Their actions were motivated by a pursuit of fairness and a strong belief that a rules-based order is essential for enduring prosperity. Counterstrike measures. After thorough consultations and planning sessions, the European Union and Canada reached a critical decision. The moment had come to pull the trigger and implement several counterstrike measures in response to the tariffs that had been imposed by the United States president. The decision was not made lightly because officials weighed the risks and benefits of every option before proceeding with a coordinated plan that was designed to hit key sectors of the American economy. The counterstrike involved the imposition of targeted tariffs on American goods that were considered both strategic and symbolic. The European Union announced that it would impose new tariffs on a range of United States products, including industrial machinery and agricultural exports. These tariffs were set at levels that were calculated to create pressure without causing immediate economic collapse. The measures were well intended as a direct response to the protectionist policies of the Trump administration. In Canada, the government unveiled its own set of retaliatory actions. Canadian officials declared that they would target sectors where American products had a significant market share. The tariffs were accompanied by regulatory reviews and adjustments in trade policies that aimed to protect Canadian industries from unfair competition. The overall message from Ottawa was one of strong disapproval of the measures of the United States and a commitment to defending national interests. Both regions coordinated their announcements to ensure that the world saw a united front against the unilateral actions of the United States. Press conferences were held at the same time in Brussels and Ottawa. and officials emphasized that the counterstrike was based on legal principles and international trade rules. They stressed that the measures were not an indication of conflict, but necessary steps to restore balance in global trade relations. The impact of the counterstrike was immediate. Exporters from the United States began to feel the pressure as their goods faced new tariffs in key markets. The measures disrupted supply chains and led to a noticeable shift in trade patterns. Business leaders in the United States, who had long taken the reliability of their export markets for granted, were now forced to review their strategies in light of the new reality. The counterstrike had succeeded in sending an intended message. The European Union and Canada would not stand idly by while American protectionism threatened the global economy. Economic analysts from various independent institutions weighed in on the developing events. Their assessments indicated that while the counterstrike would cause short-term disruptions, it was unlikely to trigger a full-scale trade war. Instead, the measures were expected to lead to a period of serious negotiations as both sides sought to find a resolution that would restore stability. The focus was on creating incentives for dialogue rather than escalating the conflict further. Within the influential circles of Washington, the response to the counterstrike was characterized by thoughtful apprehension. President Donald Trump and his advisors acknowledged the retaliatory tariffs, but insisted that the United States would remain firm in its initial decisions. Still, there were indications of concern among some members of the administration who were aware that the economic impact would eventually translate into political challenges. The counterstrike was viewed as a serious blow to the credibility of the United States in the international trade arena. Reports from several news outlets have indicated that the counterstrike is proceeding effectively and according to the established plan. Each part of the process has been recorded, and officials made sure that all actions were in line with existing trade agreements. The thorough planning behind the counterstrike was well communicated by both governments of the European Union and Canada. It felt like a moment of change where longtime allies had to take a stand against policies that they considered unjust. Within the European Union, the counterstrike was hailed as a necessary correction to a situation that had been allowed to spiral out of control. Leaders in Brussels argued that the measures would force the United States to come back to the negotiating table with a more respectful attitude toward international trade. In Canada, the sentiment was similar. The counterstrike was portrayed as a defense of national pride and economic stability, a signal that Canada would not allow its interests to be trampled by external pressures. For the American public, the news of the counterstrike came as a surprise. Many citizens had supported the tariffs as a way to protect American jobs, yet they now faced the reality that those decisions could lead to unintended consequences. The counterstrike forced a review of the policy and its broader implications. In news reports and televised interviews, experts discussed how the retaliatory measures could change future trade relations and influence the global balance of power. Throughout the implementation of the counterstrike, both the European Union and Canada maintained a strict focus on factual reporting. Every claim was backed by data, and officials were careful to avoid speculation that could be misinterpreted as misinformation. This intelligent approach was intended to keep the discussions centered on clear, verifiable facts. The counterstrike was not an impulsive reaction, but the result of months of analysis and careful planning. As the new tariffs took effect, the international trading system prepared for further adjustments. Markets responded with a mix of shock and cautious optimism, and investors began to factor in the possibility of long-term shifts in trade patterns. The counterstrike marked a decisive moment when two major economic regions asserted their rights in the face of unilateral American action. The attention now moved from quick retaliation to evaluating the wider implications of this daring action. The fallout was swift and unavoidable. What started as a show of economic might had now spiraled into a full-scale reckoning. As markets reacted and political pressure mounted, the question was no longer about enforcing tariffs, but about surviving their consequences. And for President Trump, the shockwaves of retaliation were about to hit closer than expected. The bombshell on Donald Trump. The retaliatory actions by the European Union and Canada had an unforeseen impact on President Donald Trump and his administration. The counteractions struck a heavy political and economic blow that was felt across Washington. The tariffs, initially viewed as a sign of strength, had now become the catalyst for a crisis of confidence. In both political circles and trading environments, it was clear that unilateral actions would invite equally forceful responses. For President Donald Trump, the counterstrike represented a turning point. Once known for his aggressive stance on trade, he now found himself on the defensive. Critics argued that the retaliatory measures undermined the credibility of his administration and exposed the vulnerabilities of a policy that had been crafted without full regard for international consequences. In press briefings and public appearances, Donald Trump attempted to downplay the impact, yet the tone of his statements betrayed a sense of urgency and concern. Within the White House, advisors scrambled to reassess the situation. They held meetings to determine how best to respond to the increasing pressure from European and Canadian leaders. The administration began to explore alternative measures that might soften the blow, but there was little consensus on how to proceed. The counterstrike had not only disrupted trade, but had also shaken the political foundations of a strategy that had once seemed invincible. Economic analysts shared that the bombshell delivered to Trump was not solely about tariffs. It was a signal that American policy could no longer be dictated by unilateral decisions. The coordinated actions of the European Union and Canada challenged the assumption that the United States could act in isolation without expecting significant repercussions. For many observers, this was the moment when the limits of American power in international trade were laid bare. The media played a crucial role in amplifying the impact of the counterstrike on President Donald John Trump. Headlines highlighted the irony of a policy that was meant to protect American interests, which is now leaving the nation exposed to foreign retribution. In editorials and opinion pieces, commentators debated whether the tariffs had been a strategic mistake from the start. The consensus among several seasoned analysts was that the counterstrike had forced a second look at the administration's approach to global trade. Political opponents seized on the moment to question the leadership of President Donald Trump. They argued that the administration had failed to anticipate the consequences of its actions, and that the counterstrike was evidence of a policy that had backfired. In congressional hearings and media interviews, critics called for a return to dialogue and compromise. The bombshell was seen as a setback in terms of trade. It was also a blow to the political narrative that had justified the tariffs. In response, Trump made several public statements that attempted to deflect the criticism. He maintained that tariffs were a necessary measure to protect American jobs, yet he acknowledged that the situation required careful management. His remarks, however, lacked the clarity and conviction that had characterized his earlier rhetoric. The counteractions had introduced an element of unpredictability into a policy that was once touted as a demonstration of American strength. The political fallout extended beyond America. In international forums and trade negotiations, the image of a divided American outlook on tariffs undermined the United States' position. Allies and adversaries alike began to recalibrate their strategies in light of the new reality. The bombshell on Trump was part of a broader shift in global economic dynamics. The notion that the United States could unilaterally impose its will on the world was increasingly coming into question. As the days passed, it became apparent that the decision made by both governments of the European Union and Canada had set in motion a series of changes that would be difficult to reverse. The American business community, once confident in the promise of protectionist policies, now faced risks that threatened to disrupt established markets. The bombshell on Trump had far-reaching implications, extending from the highest levels of government to the everyday lives of citizens. The impact was both political and economic, and its consequences would be felt for months to come. In every discussion about the future of American trade policy, the counteractions and their consequences took center stage. The narrative that had once celebrated the tariffs as a good initiative for America was now tempered by the reality of a powerful and coordinated response from trusted allies. For President Donald Trump, the challenge was now to rebuild credibility and navigate a landscape that had grown increasingly complex and interconnected. The bombshell had revealed all the limitations of his approach. On closer inspection, it can also be seen as the strength of international commitment to defending fair trade. The events of the past weeks have significantly affected American policy. The recent counterstrike highlighted that in today's interconnected global economy, every action leads to a corresponding reaction. Donald Trump and his administration were under great pressure, and the future is still not known. What remains clear is that the era of unilateral trade decisions is drawing to a close, and the world will be watching closely as the United States seeks to find a new path forward in this challenging environment. The fallout was undeniable. The world wasn't just reacting, it was rewriting the rules. Now, all eyes were on what came next. Repercussions and future outlook. In the wake of the counterstrike, the international trade landscape has undergone significant changes. The coordinated measures by the governments of the European Union and Canada have forced a new dialogue on international trade policies and have opened a platform for future negotiations. The results of these events are already evident in economic reports and policy discussions around the world. Analysts are now examining the long-term effects of the tariffs and the countermeasures, with many predicting that this will mark a shift in how nations approach trade and diplomacy. Economic indicators reveal that the retaliatory tariffs have caused disruptions in supply chains and have led to a temporary slowdown in trade volumes. Businesses across multiple sectors have reported an increased lack of certainty, with some even revising their forecasts for the coming months. The counterstrike has exposed vulnerabilities in markets that were once thought to be secure. As companies adapt to the new reality, there is growing anticipation that this period of adjustment will eventually lead to more balanced trade relationships. In Europe, the response to the repercussions has been cautious optimism. Government officials and industry leaders alike are exploring opportunities to diversify their markets and reduce their reliance on any single trading partner. The measures that had been previously considered purely retaliatory are now being seen as part of a big strategy to strengthen economic resilience. The European Union has expressed confidence that, despite momentary challenges, these actions will create the way for a more equitable international trading system. In Canada, the focus remains on protecting domestic industries while seeking to maintain strong ties with both traditional allies and emerging markets. Canadian policymakers are working on long-standing strategies that include modernizing trade agreements and enhancing cooperation with other nations. The results of the counterstrike have highlighted the need for flexibility and adaptability in the face of rapid changes in global economic policy. Canadian leaders are determined to use this experience to build a stronger and more sustainable economy. Political leaders in the United States are also struggling with the consequences of the counterstrike. In the United States, discussions have shifted from justifying the tariffs to exploring ways to mend the damage done to international relationships. There is a growing recognition that future trade policies must be more inclusive and based on dialogue, rather than unilateral decisions. This realization has led to discussions on how to move forward, with some calling for a complete reassessment of America's approach to international trade. The pressure on policymakers is severe, and every decision made in the coming months will be closely investigated by both local and international individuals. Financial markets have responded to these developments with a blend of caution and eager expectation. Investors are closely monitoring trade data and policy announcements, aware that the long-term impacts of the counterstrike could reshape economic alliances. The uncertainty has led to fluctuations in currency values and stock markets, and analysts are warning that volatility may continue until a new equilibrium is reached. Despite the challenges, many experts believe that this period of adjustment will ultimately lead to a more stable and predictable trading environment. On the global stage, the counterstrike has led to discussions about the rules and norms that govern international trade. Nations that have long felt sidelined in trade negotiations now see an opportunity to assert their interests. Multilateral organizations and trade forums are expected to play a greater role in mediating disputes and ensuring that trade policies are fair and transparent. The events of the past weeks have shown the need for a more collaborative approach to resolving trade conflicts, one that respects the interests of all parties involved. Looking ahead, there is cautious hope that the lessons learned from this crisis will lead to a more balanced system of international commerce. The counterstrike has served as a wake-up call for many nations, highlighting that no country can act alone in an interconnected world. As negotiations resume and new policies are crafted, there is an opportunity for lasting reform. The focus now is on rebuilding trust and creating a framework that will prevent similar conflicts in the future. While the road ahead may be challenging, the commitment to a fair and stable international trading system remains strong. The repercussions of these events cannot be seen just as a chapter in a trade dispute. They are a turning point that will influence policy decisions for years to come. With every new development, the world is reminded of the importance of cooperation and dialogue in maintaining economic stability. The actions taken by the European Union, Canada, and even the United States will be studied for their long-standing effects on international trade. This period of transformation, though marked by doubt, offers a chance to rethink and rebuild the foundations of international trade in a way that benefits all parties involved. Thank you for joining us today as we shared the latest developments in international trade. We showed how recent actions by the European Union and Canada have affected the United States and its policies. We invite you to think about changes and consider what they mean for the future. Do not forget to watch our next video for more updates. Your thoughts and feedback are important, so your comments are much welcomed. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel. We value your support and look forward to having you again.